The evening crowd buzzed with laughter and clinking cutlery inside the dimly lit restaurant. Outside, however, the air was sharp with cold, and a man dressed in tattered clothes shuffled toward the entrance. His shoes were worn down to almost nothing, his coat threadbare, and his beard thick and unkempt. He looked like a man who had known nothing but hardship for years. The hostess at the door faltered when she saw him approach, her practiced smile flickering into discomfort. But before she could say a word, he raised his hand gently and asked in a husky voice, "Please, just some leftovers. Anything that would otherwise be thrown away." The hostess hesitated, glancing toward the dining hall, afraid the man's presence might unsettle the paying customers. Before she could respond, a waitress named Clara noticed the exchange. Clara was young, in her mid-20s, juggling 2 jobs to support her sick mother. She wasn't wealthy, but hardship had softened her heart, not hardened it. Seeing the man's hollow cheeks and trembling fingers, she stepped forward. "Come inside," she said firmly, guiding him past the stunned hostess. "You'll catch your death out there." The man lowered his eyes, as though ashamed of stepping into the warm restaurant. He smelled faintly of the street, of damp cardboard and smoke, but Clara didn't flinch. She led him to a corner table, out of the spotlight, and fetched him a glass of water. When the man repeated softly, "Just leftovers, please." "I don't want to cause trouble," Clara shook her head. "You deserve a proper meal. Wait here." In the kitchen, Clara scraped together her tips for the day, money she had been saving for her mother's medicine, and ordered a fresh, hot meal. Her colleagues looked at her with disbelief. "Why would you spend your own money on him?" one of them whispered. Clara's answer was simple: "Because no one deserves to be treated like trash." When she returned with a steaming plate of food, the man's eyes glistened with something deeper than hunger, something like disbelief. He ate slowly, almost reverently, as if each bite was a gift he didn't deserve. Clara sat nearby during her short break, watching to make sure he was comfortable, occasionally refilling his water. The warmth of her kindness filled the small corner they shared, though the rest of the restaurant pretended not to notice. But what no one knew, not Clara, not the hostess, not even the manager, was that this man was not who he seemed. Beneath the layers of rags and grime was Alexander Marlowe, a billionaire known for his ruthless business acumen and cold detachment. He had spent decades building empires, yet recently found himself questioning the loyalty and honesty of those around him. Money had drawn sycophants, liars, and opportunists to his side. He had come to this restaurant in disguise, not by accident, but by design. Tonight, he wanted to test humanity, without the veil of his wealth. Clara, unaware of the charade, treated him with a kindness she couldn't afford. When he finished his meal, Alexander looked up at her and asked softly, "Why did you do this? You don't even know me." Clara smiled, though her eyes were tired. "Because I don't need to know your story to know you're human. That's enough." The words pierced him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent years surrounded by polished suits and false smiles, yet this young waitress, living paycheck to paycheck, had given him something no money could buy: genuine compassion. For the first time in years, Alexander felt small, stripped of his titles and power, standing before the raw truth of what kindness looked like when it cost something real. But even as he prepared to leave, something in her voice, in her quiet resilience, made him linger. He asked her name. He asked about her life. And when she mentioned her mother's illness, brushing it aside as if it were nothing compared to the needs of others, Alexander's chest tightened. He walked out that night, leaving behind only a polite nod and a whispered thank you. Clara thought she would never see him again, but she was wrong. The next day, the restaurant doors opened once more to a very different figure. This time, the man who stepped inside was dressed in an immaculate suit, his beard trimmed, his shoes polished to a shine. The same eyes, though piercing, familiar, scanned the room until they fell on Clara. She froze, recognizing him instantly, though she could hardly believe it was the same person she had served the night before. The hostess gasped, realizing too late the mistake she had nearly made, and the entire restaurant seemed to hush as Alexander Marlowe walked directly to Clara's station. He stopped in front of her, and the restaurant staff exchanged bewildered glances. Customers craned their necks, whispering his name. Clara's heart pounded as Alexander leaned closer and said in a voice low enough for her alone, "I was cold last night, but not from hunger. What you did, it shook me." Her lips parted, but she couldn't find words. Before she could speak, he continued, "Tell me, Clara, if you had known who I truly was, would you have done the same?" The question hung in the air, heavy, almost accusing. Clara blinked. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. The way he asked the question, with that sharp intensity behind it, made it feel less like curiosity and more like a test. For a fleeting moment, she thought of all the wealthy customers she had served before, people who expected perfect service simply because of the size of their wallets, people who never bothered to remember her name. If she had known the man in rags was one of the richest men in the country, would it have changed her? She wanted to believe not. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady though her heart raced. "I would have done the same. Because kindness isn't about who someone is on the outside or how much money they have. It's about what you're willing to give when you expect nothing back." For a long time, Alexander said nothing. He studied her, searching her face as though he could peel away layers of pretense. But there was none, just a tired, honest young woman who had nothing to gain by pretending. His jaw tightened, then relaxed, and he nodded slowly, almost himself, as if confirming a suspicion he had been holding for years. The restaurant manager appeared at that moment, clearly flustered by the billionaire's presence. "Mr. Marlowe, it's an honor to have you here. Please, allow us to offer you our finest table, complimentary of course." He gestured toward the center of the room, where a lavish spread could be arranged. But Alexander lifted a hand, dismissing the offer with quiet authority. "No, I'll sit right here," he said, pointing to the same humble corner where Clara had seated him the night before. The staff shifted uncomfortably, and used to seeing a man of his status deliberately choose such a spot, but no one dared argue. Alexander pulled out the chair himself, sitting down with a composure that silenced the whispers spreading through the dining hall. Clara remained frozen in place, caught between duty and confusion. She could feel every eye in the room on her, waiting for her to falter, to drop a plate, to make some mistake in front of this man whose name carried weight like thunder. She swallowed hard and asked quietly, "What would you like to order, sir?" His reply came without hesitation. "The same meal you gave me last night. Exactly the same." The simplicity of his request sent another ripple of shock through the room. Clara nodded, though her hands trembled as she scribbled the order. In the kitchen, her colleagues crowded around her, voices buzzing with disbelief. "Clara, what did you do? He's here because of you. Do you realize who he is? He owns half the city." She ignored their chatter, focusing instead on steadying her breath. When she returned to his table with the meal, Alexander waited until she set it down before speaking again. His voice was calm, but it carried weight, drawing her in. "Last night, you gave me dignity when I had none. You gave me a seat when others wanted me out on the street. Do you know how rare that is, Clara? In a world where people measure worth by appearance. You saw a man where everyone else saw garbage." Clara felt her cheeks burn, embarrassed by the attention. It wasn't anything special. It's just what anyone should do." "Anyone," he repeated, almost as if the word tasted bitter. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "But not everyone would. In fact, most wouldn't. That's why it matters." She had no reply. She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, but something about his presence made her unable to look away. There was power in him, yes, but also something fragile, as though he had carried away his fortune for too long and was searching desperately for something genuine to hold on to. The meal went untouched for several minutes as Alexander continued speaking, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "You remind me of something I forgot long ago. When I started, I was nothing. No one believed in me. And now that I've built an empire, I'm surrounded by people who only see the empire, not the man. Last night, for the first time in years, someone looked at me without expecting anything in return. Do you understand how rare that is?" Clara opened her mouth, but the words stuck. She wasn't used to being the one people confided in, Certainly not billionaires. All she could manage was a quiet, "I didn't do it for recognition. I just couldn't watch you walk away hungry." Her sincerity hit him harder than she realized. Alexander looked down at his untouched food, his hand resting against the edge of the table. His voice softened. "Do you know what left me cold last night? It wasn't the air outside. It was realizing how many people looked away from me when I needed them most. And yet you didn't." Clara's chest tightened at the rawness in his tone. She had seen many broken souls drift through the restaurant, men and women crushed by life circumstances. But she hadn't expected that same loneliness to dwell in a man whose name was carved into skyscrapers. At that moment, the manager reappeared, holding a bottle of the restaurant's finest wine, eager to please. "Mr. Marlowe, with our deepest apologies for any inconvenience last night. Please accept this as a gesture of our hospitality." Alexander turned to him, his expression hardening. "Apologies? Why?" "For what you would have done if Clara hadn't intervened." His voice carried through the room, silencing every whisper. The manager stammered, his face draining of color. The billionaire continued, his tone sharp as a blade. "Your hospitality means nothing if it only extends to those who look the part." The manager retreated awkwardly, leaving the bottle on the table, unsure whether to stay or flee. Clara shifted nervously, feeling the tension thicken around them. But Alexander leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his focus returning to her. "Tell me, Clara," he said quietly, "what is it you truly want in life? Not just survival, not just to make ends meet. If money were no obstacle, what would you do?" The question startled her. No one had ever asked her that before. Not really. She hesitated, glancing down at her worn shoes, the chipped polish on her nails. Dreams felt like luxuries she couldn't afford. But under his expectant gaze, she whispered, "I'd make sure my mother never had to worry about medicine again. I'd open a place where people who have nothing could come and eat without being judged. A place where no one would ever feel the way you did last night." Her words struck him like lightning. For a long time, he said nothing, only watched her with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Then, slowly, he nodded, as though tucking her answer deep into his mind. The restaurant buzzed faintly in the background, but for the two of them, the world seemed to narrow into that single corner. Alexander finally lifted his fork and began to eat, every bite deliberate, every glance at Clara heavy with unspoken meaning. And though she tried to retreat back into the rhythm of her shift, she found herself returning to his table again and again, drawn by a force she couldn't quite name. When he finished his meal, Alexander placed his utensils neatly on the plate, his posture composed. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what he would do next. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, black checkbook. But instead of scribbling down an amount, he laid the pen aside and looked at Clara. "I could write a number here that would change your life overnight," he said softly. "But that would be too easy. Money fades. What you gave me last night, what you showed me, is worth more than all the checks I've ever signed." Clara stared at him, unsure she was meant to respond, unsure what he was building toward. He closed the checkbook untouched and tucked it back into his jacket. Then he stood, towering over her, the weight of his presence pressing down on the room once more. And in that moment, as the eyes of the staff and customers followed his every move, Alexander Marlowe leaned just slightly closer to Clara, his voice dropping low enough for only her to hear Clara's breath caught in her throat as the words brushed past her ear, heavier than any promise she had ever received. She stood frozen, tray in hand, as Alexander Marlowe straightened his shoulders and strode toward the exit. The restaurant seemed to exhale with him gone, but the silence he left behind clung like smoke. Colleagues rushed to whisper in her ear, half jealousy, half awe, "Do you realize what just happened? Do you even know what that means?" But Clara couldn't answer. Her pulse throbbed in her temples, and her mind replayed his words again and again. "You haven't seen the last of me." That night, long after the restaurant closed and the others had gone home, Clara walked the quiet streets back to her tiny apartment. The city's neon lights glittered in puddles along the sidewalk, but her thoughts were far away. She remembered the ragged man who had shivered in the corner, clutching a meal as though it were a treasure. She remembered his eyes, haunted, lonely, searching. And then the very same eyes, clear and sharp, set in the face of one of the most powerful men in the country. It didn't seem real. She had helped a stranger, and that stranger had turned out to be a billionaire. But why had he chosen her? Why this restaurant? Why that disguise? She unlocked the door of her apartment quietly, careful not to wake her mother, who slept in the next room. The air inside smelled faintly of medicine and stale bread. Clara leaned against the wall, slipping off her shoes with weary movements, her mind still tangled in the night's events. She wanted to tell her mother, to share the bizarre truth of it, but what good would it do? Her mother needed medicine, not stories. So Clara kept it to herself, burying it like a secret treasure she didn't know how to use. The following days blurred into routine, serving tables, rushing orders, dodging the sneers of entitled customers. Yet beneath the monotony, an undercurrent of anticipation tugged at her. Every time the restaurant door swung open, she found herself glancing up, half expecting to see Alexander again. And each time, when it wasn't him, she felt a sting of disappointment she couldn't explain. On the fourth evening after his visit, as the dinner rush slowed and the last of the chatter dulled, the door creaked open once more. Clara, balancing a tray, caught sight of him immediately. He wasn't dressed in rags this time, nor in the commanding armor of a billionaire. Instead, he wore something understated, dark slacks, a plain coat, nothing flashy. But it was unmistakably him. Alexander Marlowe walked in as though he belonged everywhere and nowhere all at once, and this time his eyes scanned the room with deliberate precision until they landed on her. Clara's chest tightened. She set down the tray and approached, nerves sparking under her skin. "Mr. Marlowe," she greeted softly, unsure of the rules in such a surreal game. "Alexander," he corrected gently, the faintest curve of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Titles build walls. I don't want any between us." The words unsettled her more than she let on. She nodded, gesturing toward the same corner table, though he shook his head. "No, tonight you're not serving me. Tonight you're sitting with me." Her heart skipped. "I can't. I'm on shift. I'll lose my job." "You won't," he interrupted firmly, his eyes flicking toward the manager. And just like that, the manager appeared, bending over backward to assure Clara that she could sit with Mr. Marlowe as long as he wished. The hierarchy was clear. Where Alexander spoke, others obeyed. Clara sat across from him, unease tightening her posture. The table between them felt both like a barrier and a bridge. He studied her as though she were a puzzle he intended to solve. "Do you still think about that night?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. She hesitated. "Yes, though I'm still not sure why you came here, disguised like that." A flicker of shadow crossed his face, as though the question pressed on an old wound. "Because money blinds people," he said quietly. "I wanted to see who could look past the disguise. I wanted to know if compassion still existed in this world, without a price tag." Clara lowered her gaze, fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "You make it sound like you were searching for something." "I was," he admitted, "and I found it." His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "I found you." Her breath stilled, the weight of his words pressing against the fragile walls she kept around her heart. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to break the intensity. "You don't know me. Not really." "I know enough," he countered. "Enough to see honesty when it stands before me. Enough to see courage in a young woman who gave her last coins for a stranger's meal." His voice softened. "Enough to know that I haven't stopped thinking about you since." The confession hit her like a current. She didn't know what frightened her more, the sincerity in his tone, or the way part of her wanted to believe him. She shook her head. "I'm just a waitress." "You're—" She stopped herself, realizing how absurd it sounded. He already knew what he was. "And yet," Alexander murmured, leaning closer, "you're the one who made me feel human again." The world seemed to narrow around them, the hum of the restaurant fading to a distant echo. Clara's hands trembled beneath the table, hidden from view. She had spent years building walls against disappointment, against the cruelty of life that took without giving. And now, sitting across from a man who could buy the very building she worked in, she felt those walls beginning to crack. But before she could respond, Alexander reached into his coat and placed a folded envelope on the table. He didn't push it toward her, only set it down as though its weight alone was enough. "This isn't charity," he said, reading the protest already forming in her eyes. "It's an invitation to trust me, to let me prove that what I felt that night wasn't fleeting." Clara stared at the envelope, fear and curiosity warring inside her. She didn't touch it. "Why me?" she whispered, the question trembling on her lips. "Out of everyone in your world, why choose me?" Alexander's answer was simple, but it carved itself into her heart. "Because you were the only one who chose me first, when I had nothing to give." Her throat tightened, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. The envelope sat between them like a riddle, her future folded in its paper seams. She didn't know whether opening it would save her or destroy her. But in Alexander's eyes there was no mockery, no pity, only a strange, unwavering belief in her worth. And that terrified her more than anything else. "You haven't seen the last of me." The envelope lay untouched for what felt like an eternity, the thin paper carrying the weight of 1,000 possibilities. Clara stared at it, her hands curled into her lap, afraid that even brushing its surface might change everything. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unbroken, until Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, as if he were testing the depth of her resolve. Finally, with a trembling breath, Clara reached out. Her fingers brushed the envelope, and in that instant she felt her entire life balanced on a thread. She slipped it open, her pulse hammering in her ears, and unfolded the crisp sheet inside. Her eyes scanned the words, but for a moment her mind refused to make sense of them. Then, slowly, reality sank in. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a sum of money meant to erase her struggles overnight. Instead, it was a deed, ownership papers neatly signed and sealed. The deed to a building on the edge of the city. And attached to it, in Alexander's clean, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "Asterisk for the place you dreamed of, a home for those who have none, a table for those the world has forgotten." Asterisk. Clara's breath hitched, her eyes blurring with tears she had no strength to hide. I don't understand," she whispered. "You said you want to build a place where no one will be turned away," Alexander said, his voice low, steady, and filled with something that seemed to tremble at the edges of vulnerability. "I can give you the means. Not charity, not pity, but the chance to make your vision real. You gave me hope when I had none. This is my way of giving it back." The room seemed to vanish around them. The clinking glasses, the muted laughter, the weight of curious stares. It all dissolved until it was only Clara and the man who had walked into her life disguised as brokenness. She shook her head, still unable to believe. "Why me? I'm not. I don't have the skills or the knowledge, or—" "You have the heart," Alexander interrupted, firm and unwavering. "And that's what this world lacks most. Skills can be taught. Knowledge can be earned. But compassion, real, unyielding compassion, cannot be bought or faked. You have that. Clara, that's why you—" Tears slid down her cheeks as she clutched the paper, her body trembling with the magnitude of it all. For years, she had fought simply to survive, to keep her mother alive, to make it through one day to the next. Dreams had been luxuries she could not afford. And now, sitting across from her was a man who had lived every dream money could buy, offering her the one she thought she could never touch. "Alexander," her voice cracked under the weight of his name. "What if I fail?" For the first time, a faint smile curved his lips. Not the sharp, calculated smile of a man used to boardrooms and negotiations, but something softer, almost tender. "Then you fail, and you try again. Failure doesn't frighten me, Clara, but the thought of you never trying, that does." Something shifted inside her then. The fear that had chained her heart for years began to loosen. She had seen men with nothing, and she had seen men with everything. But in Alexander's eyes, she saw the truth that bound them all, the need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. He stood, his presence towering once more, though this time it felt less like dominance and more like protection. The envelope was still clutched in her hands, a fragile lifeline. He looked down at her, his gaze unwavering. "You change me," he said quietly, almost as if admitting it to himself. And I don't let go of people who change me. When he left the restaurant that night, the world seemed to ripple in his wake. Customers whispered. Staff exchanged bewildered looks. But Clara sat motionless, the deed pressed to her chest as though it were part of her own heartbeat. The weeks that followed blurred into a whirlwind. Papers were signed. Plans were drafted. And the building that had once been abandoned and forgot began to transform. Alexander appeared often, sometimes in a sharp suit, sometimes in clothes so simple he blended into the crowd, but always with the same piercing eyes, watching not from the seat of a billionaire, but as a man who had entrusted his belief to her hands. Clara worked tirelessly. She poured her soul into every detail, from the paint on the walls to the tables that would hold meals for the hungry. Her colleagues, once skeptical, began to rally around her. Strangers came forward, drawn by the spark she ignited, and slowly, what had been only a whisper of a dream became something living, breathing, unstoppable. The day the shelter finally opened, Clara stood at the entrance with her mother at her side. The building glowed with warmth, not from chandeliers or polished floors, but from the hum of voices, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of laughter from those who had once been silenced by hunger and shame. And when the first guests walked through the door, men and women in worn coats, children clutching their mother's hands, Clara welcomed them the way she had welcomed Alexander that night, with dignity, with kindness, with no conditions attached. She caught sight of him in the crowd then, not at the front, not demanding recognition, but leaning quietly against the far wall, watching with a stillness that spoke more than words. For a moment, their eyes met, and Clara felt the same electricity she had felt when he first whispered that she hadn't seen the last of him. As the night unfolded, Alexander finally approached, weaving through the crowd until he stood beside her. The laughter, the music, the clatter of plates filled the air, but his voice was calm when he spoke. "Do you see it now?" Clara looked around, the tables filled with people who had once been invisible, the smiles blooming where despair had lived, and her chest swelled with something beyond pride. "Yes," she whispered, "I see it. This is yours," he said softly. "All of it. Not mine. Not because of my money. Because of you. Because you cared when no one else would." Her throat ached with the weight of unshed tears. She turned to him, her voice trembling. "And what about you, Alexander? What do you see?" For the first time, his mask cracked completely, revealing not the billionaire, not the tycoon, but the man who had walked into a restaurant one cold night, hungry for more than food. He looked at her with eyes that no longer searched but had finally found. "I see a reason to believe again." And as the shelter's doors remained open late into the night, welcoming every soul who crossed its threshold, Clara realized a story that had begun with a homeless man asking for scraps had become something neither of them could have imagined. It was no longer about leftovers or disguises or wealth. It was about the fragile, unshakable truth that kindness has the power to rewrite destinies, not just for the one who receives it, but for the one who gives it. The night closed with a simple, unspoken understanding between them that sometimes the greatest fortunes are not found in vaults or ledgers, but in the quiet choices that reveal who we are when no one is watching. And as Clara stood there, her hand brushing against the deed in her pocket and her heart echoing with the weight of Alexander's gaze, she knew with certainty that this was not the end of their story, but only the beginning of something that would outlast even the empire he had built.